Hi, I'm Shan Wu with a Undercolor of Law hot take on the Trump gag orders again. So the Trump gag orders are back in the news because Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan District Attorney that convicted Trump of 34 felony counts, is arguing to the judge in that case that the gag order should not be dismissed now or released merely because the case is over. And also in the Mar-a-Lago documents case, Special Prosecutor Jack Smith has made a reply brief to Trump's arguments that there shouldn't be a gag order, emphasizing why there needs to be one. So we've kind of been through this drill in all of Trump's cases, but now that there's been an actual conviction in a Manhattan one, I just want to dive in a little bit as to why you would want to maintain it and what's different and what's not different about this case. So the reason to maintain the gag order is because the threat posed by Trump's entreating his followers and invigorating them to make threats is gotten worse, really, since the conviction. Now people may be really mad about this. So according to the filing that Bragg did, there have been bomb threats. There have been hundreds of messages left, some of them very racist messages, and it's not getting any better. So what's different about this? First, during the trial, the point of the gag order is to maintain the order of the trial and also to protect witnesses from being harassed or obstructed, really. So usually you say, oh, the trial's over. Let the defendants say what they want to say about the case. Here, the issue is Trump has this enormous platform. Whenever he makes threats, it causes real potential violence to happen, if not actual violence, because making bomb threats really is a violent act. So what can one do about that? Well, there's nothing really that special that needs to be done. There's not an exception that needs to be made. The judge has continuing jurisdiction over Trump as defendant. In some ways, once you've been convicted, one of the judges I used to appear in front of would always say to the defendant, things have changed. You've been found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The system and the judge actually now has a lot more control over the defendant than they did when they were presumed innocent. So there's no reason why the judge cannot continue to restrict what Trump can do and say. We can talk about this more in the other context, but again, there's this red herring of the First Amendment. Oh, he can't interfere with Trump's First Amendment rights. The First Amendment does not trump everything else in the legal system, nor does the fact that he's running for president right now somehow increase his First Amendment rights. It does make the judges and the prosecutors very worried about infringing on his First Amendment rights, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. I think they're like way too worried. There's not that much to worry about. But that's the reason that the gag order in Manhattan needs to continue. And that's the authority for doing it, because the judge has authority over Trump right now. So he certainly can't make specific threats against people. That would be easy to prosecute. And also, the gag order has been lifted to the extent that Bragg says Trump can now criticize witnesses. Personally, I disagree with that. I think, particularly now that he's been convicted, he shouldn't be permitted to go to town and start criticizing witnesses. There's this notion, though, it's kind of like tit for tat. I mean, Stormy Daniels maybe criticizes him. Michael Cohen criticizes him, so he should be able to give as good as he gets. Not really true. They weren't convicted. He's the felon. He's the one that got convicted of a crime. He shouldn't get to act the way that anyone else does. There should be restrictions. So that's the Alvin Bragg issue. Secondly, Jack Smith. So the first time that Smith asked for a gag order, Judge Cannon, to nobody's surprise, rejected that. The issue has come back now. And Trump's attorneys are, of course, arguing that there can't be any restriction on him. He's running for president, et cetera, et cetera. And Smith has made a very specific argument as to why the gag order is necessary. So first, like Bragg's case, there are actual threats of violence that have occurred. And in the Jack Smith case, there's a pretty tight reason for why that happened, which is that Trump has made this ridiculous argument that because in the search warrant procedures that law enforcement is basically authorized to use force if it becomes necessary, it's no different than any other time they're doing anything. They always have that authorization because guess what? They're armed. Trump has made that into this preposterous theory that actually the plan was to assassinate him. And he said that they were trying to get him. They were going to have the FBI assassinate him. What has that resulted in? Well, lots of threats against FBI agents and threats from Trump supporters that FBI agents will be prosecuted if Trump is re-elected for a second time. There's an interview on CNN with Andrew McCabe, former deputy director of the FBI, where he talks about the amount of abuse he and his family have taken, the swatting incidents that have happened. All of that is an outgrowth directly of this particular conspiracy theory that Trump is doing, which is the FBI was out to assassinate him. So Jack Smith pointed out that's a very specific problem and it's a very specific threat to law enforcement safety if Trump doesn't stop putting out this falsehood. And that's the key, isn't it? It's a falsehood. He is lying about what they were trying to do. So quickly, that turns into a First Amendment issue. Now he gets the First Amendment argument because his supporters and his lawyers will say, well, he has a right to lie. I mean, that's part of the First Amendment. You can lie. You can say outrageous things. Here's the difference. He's not just out on the campaign trail sort of making up lies out of whole cloth about any old topic the way he normally does. He's talking in the context of an actual criminal case. So within that context, again, the system, the judge, is able to restrict what he says because he's within this system. He's a defendant and he can be made to follow certain rules. The First Amendment comes into play with the question of why is he being made to follow a rule? Why does he have to have his speech restricted here? The answer there is because, as Jack Smith has pointed out, there's a very specific threat that Trump is posing because of this particular lie about the FBI. It's not a question of is it a lie or isn't it? The trial is not about that. It's the fact that saying these things in the context of this case has a particular effect on the safety and the conduct of the trial. Now, also on the First Amendment, you notice that in all of these cases, the main prosecutors, Alvin Bragg, Jack Smith, they never ask for a restriction against Trump to stop criticizing them. They always say it's for staff, it's for family, courtroom staff. But the judge and the prosecutors, they say, well, when it comes to us, let them talk. That's a mistake. Let me tell you why. For whatever reasons they have, for example, they think, well, maybe they have more security. They're not really in danger of that. Or it's sort of a macho kind of thing, which is, I can take that. This is part of my job. The danger is no different because when Trump's supporters or people who are inclined among those supporters to do violence see that he is allowed, that's fair game to talk about the judge, to talk about the prosecutor, that has a trickle-down effect, which is, well, if the prosecutor is really bad, really corrupt, needs to be punished, obviously the people who work for him need to be punished. Obviously, the witnesses who are in on it need to be punished. Obviously, the courtroom staff needs to be punished. So it's a real mistake to say, oh, we're going to have an exception for the top of the org chart here. Judges, main prosecutors, Trump can say whatever he wants about them. That's a mistake to make because it has that trickle-down effect. The danger continues because of that. So they need to quit doing that. They need to say, hey, he's not allowed to corrupt and obstruct with the system this way. Particularly if you look at the Manhattan case where he's already been convicted. He was found guilty. That's as much as the system can do. End of the story. Sure, let him appeal. But right now, there's a system that has found him to be guilty, and therefore there should be these restrictions they're proper to do. Now, we've also seen, we've talked about this before, how reluctant the judges are to really hit him with some kind of heavy fine or even the threat of incarceration. And you'll hear this on TV too. I was just talking about that today. There's always this question of, this is such a unique situation. He is a candidate for president, and you have to be so careful. Judges are so reluctant to infringe on his First Amendment rights. That doesn't really make any sense. Obviously, the danger is that he has such a big platform. That's why it's so dangerous when he makes these threats, when he goads people on to do violence. But that's not the issue. Two things. One, there is plenty for him to talk about that has nothing to do with this case. It's not as though he's not allowed to talk about policy or to criticize his opponent's record. That's the obvious point. The second point is, what are they so afraid of? Why are they reluctant to punish him out of respect for the First Amendment? They're not saying, we're saying you have no First Amendment rights. They're not saying we're violating the First Amendment. They're afraid of doing something which might later be argued violates the First Amendment. So let's review. What is the remedy for a First Amendment violation? More speech. Nobody who's been convicted of a crime is going to get that crime reversed because their First Amendment rights were infringed. I mean, it's different if your defense is the First Amendment, which is I wasn't actually threatening anyone. I was actually just exercising my free speech rights. But in the case where you've been convicted of something and you had a restriction during the trial or after the trial on what you could say, that is not going to get reversed on First Amendment grounds. I mean, maybe there could be some damages at some point, but that's what makes it so silly that the courts are so afraid to actually enforce these gag orders. There's no real consequences to it. I'm not suggesting the courts should be reckless and ignore the First Amendment. They're being very careful to try to honor it, but they're too fearful of potentially later being found that they infringed Trump's First Amendment rights. And what's the danger of that? Well, in the meantime, people could be hurt. That's the danger. All right, so that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and keep those comments and replies coming. It's really helpful to hear that from you. Thanks, and talk to you soon.
Love this video? Make sure you stay up to date on the latest breaking news and all things Midas by signing up to the MeidasTouch newsletter at MeidasTouch.com/newsletter.